Hey guys, so yesterday's video we talked about the stock market crash. Today we're going to talk about the Great Depression in Texas. I'm going to show you guys about 15-20 photos about individuals in Texas and what they were going through. So individuals in Texas and their communities tried to provide relief for those hit hardest. Merchants offered credit for people to buy goods. Credit really wasn't something that was widely used. Like now we have credit cards, but it wasn't something widely used until after this time period. So now we use credit for a lot of things. People buy cars and houses on credit, things like that that they can't afford outright. They use credit, but back then things like credit weren't really used, so it was very new at the time. So merchants, shop owners offered people to let them buy stuff from them and then pay them back later. Businesses supported gardens to grow food for the needy people. Many communities raised funds to help feed hungry people, and soon people began to look to the state and federal governments for help. Before this, the state and federal government didn't have a whole lot to do with helping the individual citizens. They would help businesses every once in a while, they would help other states, but they weren't really solely concerned about helping the individual citizen. This changed after the Great Depression. So we're going to check out some photos of the time period during the Great Depression, and then the video will be done today. So this was a woman in 1939 drawing water from a well in her backyard to supply the family with enough drinking water since the resources were scarce. At the same time period during the Great Depression was also happening something called the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl was a time period of severe drought in the Midwest, including North and Northwest Texas and West Texas. And so the water was very scarce, and so it was a very valuable commodity, and it was hard to get in some places. And so this is showing that. Here's a family making tortillas to give to pecan shellers in exchange for their share of their crop. And so they're making tortillas, and instead of giving them money for the pecans that they're shelling, they're giving them food, tortillas in exchange. So the barter system kind of came back during this time period because people didn't have money to give, but they did have some different skills or other things that they could trade for. So they traded tortillas for pecans. We'll talk about the WPA tomorrow, but the Works Progress Administration was always there to assist the unemployed. So this is a line of people waiting to find work at a clothing store in 1939. This family was resettled by the Resettlement Administration, another organization started during the Great Depression, part of FDR's New Deal that we'll talk about tomorrow as well. It relocated struggling families to government communities in 1936, and this is one of those families. Here's a dust storm that hit Amarillo, Texas in April of 1936. This is, like I said, because of the Dust Bowl. It ruined farmland that families had desperately needed to support themselves. So because of the severe drought, the land on top, the topsoil was what it was known as, turned to dust instead of being thick and dark like soil is when it has plenty of moisture. And so when the windstorm started to come through, that dust got picked up off the topsoil and tossed into the air, and that became known as the Dust Bowl. This sharecropper was elated when his corn turned out so well. He hoped to repay his loan by the end of 1936, and by the look of this, he would do that and then some. So some people did have some success, very rarely, but it did happen. Here is a son looking happy on how he pickled vegetables and how they turned out. So like I said, there was some happiness during this time period, but it was sometimes few and far between. People still turned to God whenever they could. This church was in a tent on the roadside for displaced laborers in 1937, so they did still have some normal parts of their lives. Here's people that are picking cotton in Kaufman, Texas in 1936. They earned 50 cents for every 100 pounds. Here is fruits of their labor. There's more cotton right here, so they get even more and more of it and eventually be able to make things out of it. Here's sharecroppers, a child in a hall in one of the 10 halls in this area where they would live. So they would often come together as a community and live in areas together, trying to lend a helping hand. So she's getting water from the well. Here's a town square, once that were very busy, hustling and bustling, and now is desolate and abandoned because people couldn't afford to keep their businesses open, and people couldn't afford to go to those businesses anyway. Here's a bank that was barred shut, one of the half of the banks in the United States that went out of business. When the Great Depression first started in 1929, many people tried to go get money out of the bank, which made even more banks fail. And so they had to shut their doors completely. Most of the banks were some of the biggest buildings in the cities, and so they weren't knocked down or anything like that, but they were barred and shut, keeping people out of them. And this is in June of 1938. Here is a cafe. There's no business that wasn't affected by the Great Depression, and this is June 1937. Here's a tractor driver near Memphis, given $1 a day, a house like this to live in, and a cow to milk in exchange for 10, 11-hour workdays. So that's how they paid them. They'd give them $1, but then they'd also give them somewhere to live and a cow to give them some milk to drink. So here are some animals that are, getting food as well. A lot of animals suffered during the Great Depression as well because they had not enough food for humans, let alone for animals as well. So many of the animals had a hard time as well. Here is a child loving on a cow. Here's people saying everyone pitched in to make sure food shortages were never a reality. So a lot of farmers would bring their food together and distribute it equally out to people. And then here is a older sister holding a younger sibling. So, like I said, not everything during the Great Depression was bad, but it was tough times for a long time. It was almost a decade long, from about 1929 into about the start of World War II in 1941 in the United States. And so it was a pretty tough time for a lot of people, but they did see their way through it. And we'll talk about how and what programs the government had that helped a lot of people get through it. Thanks, guys.